I'm Dean Cifola, and this is the Azure Academy. Last time we talked about resource groups and how every resource must live inside a resource group. And now we want to start building resources. And in IaaS, which is the infrastructure as a service, the foundational resource that we need is a virtual network. So, what exactly is a virtual network? Well, in Azure, as we previously talked about, we still have to run physical data centers where there are physical routers and switches and network cables, servers, network cards, all of that stuff. And then we take that physical network and layer on top of it a software defined network, and that has virtual routers and switches and NICs and all of those things. And we call that a virtual network or a VNet. And that provides us a logical isolation inside the Azure cloud that is dedicated to your subscription. So what does that mean? Imagine that we have like two competitors, Coke and Pepsi. Now, Coke and Pepsi, vicious competitors, but they both want to use Azure, and we, as the provider, do not want to allow anything that Coke or Pepsi does to overlap each other, and we certainly don't want their information leaking onto the other's network. So we have this software defined network, which is the VNet, and that's going to allow them to have traffic flowing over the same physical switches, the same NIC that's on the same host, and never see each other's data. In fact, they could even be using the same exact IP address range, which we'll talk about what that is in a second. And these ranges could overlap each other, in fact, be the same exact IP addresses and never see each other. So in the VNet, what else can we do? Well, Azure provides DNS and internet access by default. So DNS, just to cover that quickly, DNS stands for the Domain Name System. It's how you can type, www.azure.com into your favorite web browser, and that'll pull up a web page. And you could do that instead of having to type out the 137.135.107.235, so it's more convenient. So DNS also works internally on a network, so you can type in a host name like DC1 or the fully qualified domain name, or FQDN for short, of dc1.contoso.com, instead of having to type 192.168.0.4. So it's a shorthand that's more logical for humans than the numbers. Internet access is also open by default, but you can choose to block or redirect that internet traffic. But Azure provides you the SNAT, or Secure Network Address Translation, which allows you to route beyond Azure and get to the public internet. Finally, the VNet also allows you to communicate with any other resources in Azure in your subscriptions, even across different regions in Azure, as well as connect to your on-premises networks. So the VNet does quite a lot, and like I said, is our foundational resource for IaaS. So with that, let's start building our first VNet. So here's our Azure portal. And we left off with the Azure Academy resource group, and it's currently empty. So we want to build a new resource. So we can do that by clicking our Add button. And then we need that virtual network. So this is our marketplace again, and you can see virtual network is one of our highlighted items that we have here. And you could either click that or type in the word virtual network, which I'll do. And you can see the list filters as we type it out. And there's our same virtual network item, and you could even make that a favorite if you want. And again, when we're building things, we have that resource manager or classic. Everything we're doing is going to be resource manager. So we hit create. Now, a virtual network needs a few things. We need a name, an address space, which we talked about a second ago, and what subscription and what resource group we're putting it in. It also needs a location, and we're going to create our first subnet. So a subnet is how we take our virtual network address space, which in this case you can see by default it comes up with this 10.0.0.0/16. So the /16 refers to the subnets and how many IP addresses, in this case 65,000 plus, are available within this network space. So I'm going to change this to be much simpler, just for an example. And we'll say that this is a /24. And each of the 192 addresses or 172.16 addresses or 10 addresses, this is what's known as the RFC 1918. This is the private address space that's available for people to build all their networks on. And then there's the public address space, which refers to the internet, which has different ranges. So if you're making a virtual network, it's best practice to keep to the RFC 1918 addresses. Those again start with the 10 dot or the 172 dot or the 192 dot address ranges. While although you could technically let's see, 172.180.0/24. You could do this, it's just not normally done or recommended because this is a kind of a public address space that's out in the world, and if you wanted to make your stuff publicly accessible, we have other ways of doing that, which we'll get into later with public IP addresses. But for now, we're just going to keep this a small network by default. So we have 256 address ranges now because we have made this a /24. So some of this stuff, if you're not familiar with networking, can be kind of complex. So I have a tool that I like to use, and I downloaded this from the Microsoft Store, and this is just called the IP Subnet Calculator. And in this tool, you can put in your address range at the top here, and it tells us it's a Class C address. And then it tells us that right now with a /24, this is going to be your subnet mask. See, that's what that always meant, is that there are 254 hosts or IP addresses available in this subnet range. And then we have some more complicated stuff down here that we don't really need for Azure, but these two buttons here are quite helpful for going to the next subnet or a previous subnet. So if I hit this, we change from 192.168.0.0/24 to 192.168.1.0/24. Okay, and then you can see your IP address range at the bottom here change as we go through different subnets. Okay. So useful tool, and we can also do this with the really big networks, 10.0.0.0/8, and there you have really large number worth of IP addresses, and that's how your IP address range would look. So in Azure, we're just going to do right now 192.168.0.0/24, and we're going to keep this in our subscription and put it back in our Azure Academy resource group, which is already in the same East US region. And again, we don't have to be in the same region as our resource group, but we'll keep it there. And then we have our first subnet that we're going to create here with the portal. And by default, the first name is default. We can change that to whatever we would like. In fact, I'm going to change it to management. And now we have a warning here, and this is because our subnet, which we have listed here, which is currently 10.0.0/24, does not fit within the IP address range that we have specified above, and that's because we changed this earlier. So we're going to change this 68.0.0, and then we're going to put this in a /28. And you can see that gives us 16 IP addresses. And again, I figured that out by going into our tool and type 168.0.0 and said, I want this to be smaller. Okay. Now, why do we have 14 here if Azure is telling us 16? So this is because in networking, there is something called the broadcast and the gateway addresses, and that's the first and the last IP address in that range. So those IP addresses are always unusable by default. So you cannot build a system anywhere, even on a private network, that uses .0 or that uses 255. So you cannot have a system that you can get to on a network that is 192.168.0.0. Can't do that because that address is consumed by the network, so the network can talk to the rest of the network. So you can start with .1, and you can also go up to .254. In Azure, on top of those 2 IP addresses that you cannot use, Azure further takes away another 3 addresses. So you can't use .255, and you cannot use .0, .1, .2, or .3. So the very first usable IP address is .4. Okay, and we take those 3 addresses away so that we can manage our software-defined network on top of everything else that's going on in Azure. So we're going to stick with our .28 here. It gives us 16 IP address ranges, and we still have plenty to play with. And now let's give this guy a name. We'll say this is our VNet. Very inventive. Now, there's a couple other things here that we'll come back to in a second. We'll just leave them by default as basic and disabled. And now let's just create it. Okay, so Virtual Network only takes a few seconds to create. So we'll go back to our Azure Academy resource group. See our notification here. Deployment is in progress. Okay. Now you can see here as I hit refresh, we have one item deploying. So what's going on here? So this is our Microsoft Virtual Network, and it has today's date and a timestamp for when this happened. And if I click on this guy to see what it's doing, it brings us to this overview screen where it is creating our virtual network. And we could look at our details of this operation, how long it's been going, what it's doing, what the resource ID would be of this item, the template that was used to create it, if there were any input parameters, which there generally are, and we didn't have any outputs, so this is blank. And we come back here and our VNet is done apparently. And let's go back to our overview, and look, there it is. There's our virtual network. Okay, so inside the virtual network, here's our address space that we created. DNS, as we talked about, is currently provided by Azure. Here's our location, what our resource group is, our subscription ID, tags that we haven't gotten into yet, and then we're back to our default blade. So overview, activity log, access control, tag, diagnostics, all the same. Now we get into this section, which is unique for the resource. For right now, let's look at our address spaces. So we have an address space of 192.168.0.0/24, but we are not limited to that. We can add additional address spaces like 192.168.1.0/24, since that was according to our Subnet Calculator. That's the next subnet. Oh, that's 28. Helps if it's 24. So there, that's our next subnet. And you can do this and keep going, .2.0/24. And now we've just added multiple address spaces, which increase the range of our virtual network. So now we have, let's do just one more so I can, this is .3.0/24. There we go. Now we've increased our virtual network from 256 addresses to 1,000 addresses. And we could keep going. We won't just for time's sake, but there's other things that you could do. In our subnets, we only have one subnet right now. So there's currently 11 accessible addresses. That's because, remember, from our /28, there were 14 because there's the gateway and the broadcast that we can't use. So we have 14 addresses that were possible in a network. We take 3 more, so there are 11 that are usable by you. And we can create another subnet. So let's call this one web. Okay, and because we're taking the first subnet already, we're given by default the next subnet that's available in that same range. And you can see that uses the 11 addresses that we are allowed to use, plus the 5 that we can't, which accounts for the broadcast and the gateway, as well as the 3 that Azure take for management. Okay, and so this is now adding. See our notifications keep generating. So here we have now two subnets. Now I'm going to try for a third, but watch what happens if I try this. Let's say I change this to /24. Oh wait, something's wrong. You can't do that because this is an invalid CIDR block, so the address range that you have tried to do is invalid, and it suggests try this other range instead. Now I could try this, and that's okay. So I can make one subnet that's as large as the entire address space, which is what I will do here. Let's see, let's call this one um, just test. Okay, so in a few seconds that'll finish. There we go. So we had our address space of 192.168.0.0 that has currently two subnets in it. And then we have 192.168.1.0, and that currently has one subnet that consumes the entire usable address space. So you could do it either way. You can have one subnet for your whole space or break it up into different subnets. Now, why would you want to do either one? Now, the one thing that I should mention is that in a virtual network, everything is accessible by everything else in the virtual network by default. So if you were on 192.168.0.4, which is our first IP address range that's accessible here, and you wanted to talk to a system at 192.168.1.4, that would be open by default. If you want to block that traffic, and so that this subnet cannot talk to this subnet, then we can do that with Network Security Group. And the network security group provides rules in the network that what is allowed to talk to what on what specific ports. So you could segment these out if you want to block traffic or deny all traffic and only allow specific traffic. So that's really kind of why you do subnetting. Now there's another subnet here, which is the gateway subnet. Now the gateway is how we get back to our on-premise resources. So we're going to create a gateway here, and you notice that you cannot set the name. It must always be called gateway subnet. Right now we're going to leave it as a /28, and we'll just create that. Okay, and so in a few seconds, there we go. Now we've got a management network, a web network, a test network that consumes the whole address space, and we have a gateway subnet. All right, so that brings us to DDoS. Now, DDoS is denial of service, and that's when you get attacks that come in the thousands or millions of requests per second meant to overwhelm routers and penetrate networks. So by default, everyone gets DDoS basic protection. Then specifically, if you have a public presence on the internet that happens through a public IP address, then you can enable standard DDoS protection for your virtual network, which would protect this network from any kind of DDoS attack. Okay, so we're going to discard this right now because we don't have a public internet presence yet. We can get out, but the internet can't get in. Okay, that's basically what that would help us with. So here's DNS, and DNS by default is provided by Azure. So that means that we are hosting the DNS service for you. So every VM that you would have in Azure would have a fully qualified domain name, and it's generally not something that we use in IaaS. We would want a custom DNS, and that's so we can manage it because we need it as part of our network and how we're going to manage things through something like Active Directory. So to do that, you would set a custom, and then you type in the IP address of your DNS server, which if you're using domain controllers, normally is your domain controllers. And normally, you'd want that as your first accessible IP address, which would be 192.168.0.4. Okay, so I'm going to discard this right now because we don't have anything to provide DNS. So right now, the only thing can provide it is Azure. Now we have peerings. So peerings is where you can have your virtual network connect to other virtual networks that are in this subscription or other subscriptions that are managed by you in the same Azure Active Directory. So I'm going to click Add here, and I'm going to say that this is in Resource Manager, not Classic, although you can bridge back to Classic if you have to. And you can choose from the virtual networks that are within your subscription. If you want to go to something in another subscription, you have to check this box for I know my resource ID, and you put in the full resource ID, which I'll show you where that is in a second. And that will then let you connect to something in another subscription, but it must be in the same Azure Active Directory. That way you have access to the resource, and then you have to have permissions on that resource in the other subscription that will allow you to establish this peer. Okay, I don't have another network that we're going to be peering with right now, so we'll cancel that. And I wanted to show you where that resource ID is. It's right here. Okay, so in properties, here's your resource ID. So you would grab this from the properties of that other virtual network, and then you'd stick that into the peerings box. Okay, so service endpoints. I know there's a lot to cover, but a service endpoint is where we have services in Azure, and this list is always growing, where these are things that are in Azure, generally some PaaS kind of service that has some internet-facing presence, but you want to access it privately. So you don't want this traffic to route out to the internet. You want to route directly to that service. So you could enable this service endpoint, which would basically allow routing in your virtual network to go directly there and not through the internet. So you basically route over the Azure backbone. Um, so you select whatever the service is, and then you select what subnets this should be enabled for. And while you can select all, generally speaking, you don't want these things enabled on your gateway subnet. Okay, so we uncheck the gateway. You can have it accessible for everything else. You hit add. Okay, and then we have our properties like we have already looked at, locks that we've covered in other places, and pretty much everything I wanted to cover about virtual networks at the moment. We're going to spend more time in virtual networks as we start provisioning resources, but that's it. Now that we have a network, we can start talking about creating some VMs.